Welcome to all of you, and it gives me great pleasure, and I'm quite delighted, in fact, to have Ashish Kothari speak at this second talk in our colloquium series on sustainable farming. And we've all known, many of us have known Ashish or known of his work for decades. And he is the preeminent environmentalist of the global south, in fact. And he has been involved in a number of environmental movements and at the intersection of environment, justice, and rights-based issues. And is part of and has been part of many international committees that do work on these topics, and also in India. Today, he's going to speak to us about food sovereignty and sustainable agriculture. That's the title of the talk. Over to you, Ashish.
Thanks a lot, Sujata and Chela. This is a great opportunity. Thanks for that. So I will maybe just a couple of initial remarks, and then I'll get into the presentation. And the remarks being that I confess I've never grown my own food, other than some small pots in the veranda. So ideally, this is the sort of thing that farmers and pastoralists and all should be talking about. But much of what I'm going to talk about is what I've learned from these communities. So, but I don't pretend to speak on their behalf. I'm just trying to present what I think is the picture with regard to agriculture and food in different parts of India and a little bit globally, and how that relates to other issues that I've been more closely worked with, including ecology and democracy. So I just wanted to make that caveat in the beginning. Okay, so I will see if I can share the screen with my presentation, and I propose to break it into 3 parts so that it's not a one long presentation, but maybe have short discussions in the middle and then have enough time at the end. We have 2 hours totally, right? Okay. So let me know if the screen share works. Is that fine? You can see the whole screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. So what I thought I'll do today is to look at the sort of intersections between different aspects of our life. Food obviously is central to all of us, without which we can't do anything. But food has its own politics, its own social, cultural, and economic issues, and of course, fundamentally ecological issues. So I want to look at that, the intersections amongst these different aspects, and the way they're playing out primarily in India, and a little bit more globally also. So I'm proposing to do this in 3 or 4 parts. The first part is looking at India's agricultural heritage and the kind of destruction that we've seen in the last few decades in particular. I'll take a break there and then see if there's any questions or comments from anybody. And then the next 2 sections will be the main course of the meal, which is looking at many different examples of people trying to achieve, sort of go against the trend of agricultural destruction and food devastation and so on, and trying to achieve food sovereignty or food security in their own different grounded ways. And I'll look at examples from different parts of India. And then emerging from those examples, what kind of a more holistic framework emerges with regard to food and agriculture. And maybe at that point, again, take a break. And then I'll end with a little bit of reflections on the kind of networking that is taking place right now, to see how those sorts of initiatives can actually be taken to a much more macro scale, so that you can change things at the macroeconomic and political level also. So that's the proposal. Okay. So let me get straight into this. This is something that I think this audience doesn't really need to be reminded of, but it nevertheless is worth reiterating that we have in a country like India, we can't talk about livelihoods without talking about nature and natural resources and vice versa. The intersections, the interconnections between nature and ecosystems and wildlife and biodiversity and so on and people's livelihoods is very, very intricate and very deep. And even now, despite all the so-called economic growth and globalization and so on and so forth, 60 to 70% of India's population is still direct. Of course, all of us are in one way or the other, but 60, 70% are directly on a day-to-day basis dependent on nature for their survival, their livelihoods, and so on. And so therefore, when there is destruction of the environment, it's a direct impact, not just on biodiversity and wildlife, which is important, but also on people's livelihoods and cultures and survival. Um, India probably has the world's most diverse agricultural heritage as a civilization or as a subcontinent. Many, many thousands of years of living with nature, of husbanding nature in different sorts of ways, whether it's in forestry or in pastoralism or fisheries or farming. And through that, the development of a very large diversity of species and varieties that we use. I'm just giving a few examples here. Within crops, for instance, we're just about finishing the mango season. But when I ask this question, okay, how many mangoes do people know? At the most, on an average, people will say five, maybe in a whole classroom of students, they can name about 10 mangoes. And most people are not aware that we probably have more than 1,000 varieties of mangoes in India. And probably had, maybe no longer so, but 300,000 varieties of rice, and so on. Same thing with livestock, very, very large diversity of different kinds of domestic animals, including dogs. It's very interesting because most of us tend to have dogs from outside India, but actually there's at least 35 breeds of Indian dogs, many of whom are facing decline and extinction because nobody seems to like them. We all prefer the Labradors and the Pomeranians and so on. So this enormous diversity of agricultural crops and livestock is itself based on, like I said, an enormous diversity of agricultural systems that people have developed. Many, many different kinds of pastoralist systems, for instance, nomadic, settled, many different kinds of farming, depending on where you are, which agroecological zone you're in, many kinds of fisheries and so on. And also very important to note that this kind of diversity is not just something that's been given to us by nature. Of course, the origins are in nature, but it is born out of deliberate experimentation, observation, very keen observation, trials, etc., by farmers. And I think this is very, and other kind of agriculturists. And this is very, very important to note because we tend to think of agricultural science or agricultural experts as only those who are sitting in laboratories in our agricultural research stations and so on. But actually, every farmer and every pastoralist and every fisher is a scientist or is a knowledge generator and an innovator in many different ways, which is why you get the 300,000 varieties of rice and so on. And also worth noting that because of these systems, these livelihoods, so to speak, not being jobs, but being truly livelihoods as in ways of life in which the economy, the culture, the society, and all are integrated. We also see how diversity, biological diversity in agriculture is able to meet many different kinds of needs, not just the need for food, basic food, but also medicine or cultural practices or many other sorts of things. And this kind of diversity is what has been completely neglected and ignored in the development of modern agriculture. And I'll come back to that. What's very important also is that it's not just in husbanded systems, human manipulated systems, but also in nature from where we get enormous amounts of resources for our needs. Foods, several hundred different species of wild plants and animals have been used traditionally. It still are many of them still in use for food, and of course for medicinal purposes and so on. And 20 years back, when we did our national biodiversity strategy and action plan, we came up with this figure of at least 10,000 species of plants and animals, wild plants and animals, being used for different kinds of purposes in India. Now, that kind of heritage, both the biological and the cultural heritage and the economic and the intellectual heritage behind it, is in severe threat. This is because of the model of development that we have chosen in general, where huge amounts of natural and agricultural ecosystems have been destroyed. You can see some statistics here. And it's also because of the nature of the model of agricultural development itself. All the different colors of revolutions we've had, with the green and the white and the blue revolution and so on, have been so intensely focused on a certain very narrow notion of productivity and a narrow notion of what is expertise and what is knowledge, that much of this heritage of thousands of years has been wiped out or is in the process of being wiped out. So yes, we've increased productivity of certain food grains, we've increased productivity of milk and of fish and so on, but at a very, very huge expense and cost, both of the communities who've been practicing this traditionally, but also in terms of sustainability. So the Green Revolution model simply cannot. Okay, and that's interesting. I don't know if you could hear the noise behind me, but that's pesticide spraying, supposedly for controlling insects. That's great timing. So uh, the, the notions by which this kind of agricultural development has been done do not take into account or do not consider the traditional heritage of agriculture as being something that is important to build on. In a way, they do build on it, because all high yielding varieties and GMOs and so on, in one way or the other, they use traditional varieties of seeds, but they don't really recognize or acknowledge the fact that those traditional varieties are important in themselves. So it's more like a extractivist science, which takes what is available in either in nature or in communities, and then uses it and then claims credit for creating high yielding, creating new so-called advanced or modern seeds and livestock breeds and so on. So there's many different reasons why there's been this kind of destruction, and I don't want to go too much into it, because in this session I'd much rather speak about the signs of hope than the kind of destruction that's taken place. There's that one last statistic on this slide, I think is itself indicative of everything that's gone wrong. If we really had good agricultural development, appropriate ones, there was be no reason for 300,000 farmers to be committing suicide. And that's a process that continues even now, with even in the most, or in fact, especially in the most so-called agriculturally developed parts of India. Now, I want to place this in the context of the overall development model, which we have seen, especially in the last maybe 30 years or so of globalized development since 1991. We've seen that India has actually grown by leaps and bounds in terms of the normal indicators, the sort of conventional indicators of growth. GDP, the number of cars, per capita income, number of cell phone connections, etc. And then overall, the fact that our finance minister very proudly said that we are now the 5th largest economy in the world. And so, of course, we see a lot of glitz and we see a lot of glamour, and this is a part of India I don't want to deny. It is certainly there. And for a lot of people like us who are on this call, it is certainly something that we have benefited from. But there is also the other side, and that's a huge other side which needs to be looked at, which is that this kind of development has, number one, caused enormous ecological destruction, which I already mentioned. But number two, also created an even bigger schism or a gap between the rich and the poor. We already had a lot of traditional inequalities. Can you hear me okay, or is that disturbing?
We can hear you.
It's fine.
Okay. All right. I hope it goes away soon before it smothers me with its DDT or whatever they're spraying. So so this other issue is that the traditional inequalities we already had in terms of caste and gender and so on have been added to by a huge amount of increasing economic inequality. And this latest figure of 5% of Indians, which would include some of us on the call, earning as much as the rest of the 95%, um, and enabling something like the world's biggest single family house, which you see on the screen right now. I'm sure everybody knows whose house that is an abysmally shameful aspect of India's life. Of course, it's global. This kind of inequality is happening across the world, and some countries it's worse. But it's so visible in India, and so clearly unnecessary if we had thought of different ways of doing things. And this is what is actually showing right now with COVID, where 90% of India's workforce is in the informal sector. I want to make a distinction here between those who are in the informal sector who are self-reliant if they still have intact ecosystems, forests or coastal areas, rivers or whatever it is. And the other part of the informal economy, which is extremely insecure, which has got very, very vulnerable because they don't have such intact ecosystems, or because they're fitting into an industrial system or an urban system, which simply does not give them security. And we see the results of that in the current COVID crisis, where such an enormous number of hundreds of millions of people are left without occupations, or left without markets to be able to sell their products in, or simply are not able to cope. So even in terms of broad statistics, according to a book that Asim Srivastava and I wrote a few years back, looking at mostly government data, we figure that if poverty is to be looked at in terms of lack of adequate nutritious food, or lack of clean drinking water, or lack of facilities for health, or lack of sanitation and so on, then at least 70% of India is still poor. And in fact, many people who are not poor, who had intact ecosystems to depend on, have been further impoverished because of displacement by so-called development projects, or sometimes even by wildlife national parks and sanctuaries and so on. And so, yeah, we should be, I guess, proud about the fact that we have the world's largest number of malnourished and undernourished women and children, including in the states which have had amongst the highest rates of growth, such as Gujarat. Very high levels of stunted children, of malnourishment, and so on. We also have had since 1991, especially in the last 2 or 3 decades, an increasing privatization of healthcare, and a lack of adequate government inputs into things like food and health, which again we're seeing the consequences of right now. Maharashtra, for instance, has the lowest amongst the lowest percentages of health budget in the country, and the country's is already very low compared to globally. And we're seeing the consequences of that in terms of how hospitals are simply not able to take care of the COVID affected populations in Pune, Mumbai, etc. So what, and again I said this before I get to the alternatives, is that this current crisis we're in right now, which is kind of been, it's come on top of already existing global crises of climate, biodiversity, inequality, conflicts, and so on, has really exposed very, very sharply the fault lines in Indian society, and Indian economy and Indian politics, and the vulnerability of such a huge, large, the majority of our population to these kinds of crises. So we can either go in the direction of trying to get back into so-called normal, which is what the government and corporations want, and more into authoritarian ways of doing things, more into profiteering, now mostly online. Or we can use this as an opportunity to seek very fundamental changes in the way we look at our economy and politics, and in particular for today, our agriculture and food. And that's what I'd like to get into next. But before I do that, I'm going to take a short break and see maybe if people have any immediate comments or questions. And don't ask, okay, what's the way out of it? Because that's what I'm going to get into now. But if there's any questions or clarifications on the problem part of it.
Ashish, there's some questions on the chat. I think just one person has actually asked this question. Are you able to see the chat, or should I read
Is
it?
this from Kunutur Srinivas Reddy, the division of people based on, or there's one before that on geneticists and plant breeders. There's two.
Would you like to respond to them now, or?
Yeah, okay, so the first one, or both of them are from Kunutur. Yeah, I am not, maybe, sorry if that seemed to be the case. I was not necessarily blaming scientists for farmer suicides. I was talking about the pathways of agricultural development that we've had, which has actually marginalized very, very large sections of the farming population, especially the small and marginal farmer, or driven them into models of farming which require more and more and more monetary investments like chemical fertilizers and seeds and so on, which then make them indebted, and then they are, and of course a lot of their debts are not from banks, so you can keep doing your bank waivers and so on, but that doesn't help because the majority of debts are incurred to money lenders in villages. So it builds on a traditionally unequal system already and makes it much worse. Whereas in fact, and the alternatives I'll show you, would have been pathways by which these small and marginal farmers could have become much more self-sufficient and self-reliant, building on their own knowledge and adding also modern science and technology to them. So it's not really about blaming the scientists, but, and you're right here, the political industrial business nexus is what should be pointed to. And division of people based on caste, religion, region is purely for vote bank politics, who are to be blamed ultimately for the state of affairs. Is it the minority who are ruling the majority? Yeah, so I think if you look at the distribution of power, and I was going to get into this in the next slide here, as you look at the distribution of power, it's highly unequal everywhere across the world, but certainly in India. But that can be seen in terms of whether it's the state, which is highly centralized and is in the control of a handful of people, or private corporations, or in other ways, including, for instance, patriarchy, where the domination of men. Like, who decides on what kind of agricultural development takes place? It's a fact that the majority of people who are in the highest levels of decision making with agriculture or any development are men. So there's a certain masculinist or patriarchal way of also looking at things that also affect the kind of decisions that we're taking. So that's in response to Kunutur, but we can get into more discussion on that later if need be. I should say that necessarily in a short conversation like this, my comments and responses will be a bit simplistic. I'm sorry about that, but I'd be very happy to get into deeper conversations subsequent to this. T. Swaminathan, is India still an agricultural country? Swaminathanji, yes. I mean, at least the latest statistics suggest that 55 to 60% of India is still dependent on agriculture and allied activities, which includes forestry and fisheries and pastoralism and so on. So I don't know, Chella and Sujata, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And it's interesting that even there is a substantial section even of the urban population that is dependent on one or more of these sectors. So I think we need to consider that as being important. High yielding varieties are a necessary evil at that time. I don't know. I mean, there was a very, very interesting discussion at the time of independence, and then in the 1960s when the Green Revolution was brought in, where there were a number of people, including some scientists, who were actually saying that our own levels of knowledge and the seeds and the diversity that we have right in India are adequate for us to build on to be able to remove the kind of hunger and poverty that we have. There is no need to go into the Green Revolution kind of technology. Dr. Richaria, for instance, rice research scientist, was one of these who prominently, because he researched on rice varieties across central India, and he said that there are varieties that are very, very high yielding on their own, we don't need hybrids, we don't need stuff coming in from outside, which is displacing our own diversity. So there's some really good debates from that time, which suggests that this notion that the Green Revolution was a necessary thing and in hindsight was considered to be a problem is itself to be questioned. There's also research by I think it's Richa Singh and others on how the notion that India was hungry was partly also raised because only rice and wheat were considered. And in fact, the entire production of millets and all the other food grains on which people were then dependent was ignored. But if we had looked at that, then the sole narrative of India being insufficient, having insufficient grains itself can be challenged. There's some very good research on that. And the kind of corporate and government interests, vested interests that were behind this narrative of wheat and rice, including the US Agriculture Department, which wanted to export its technologies around that time. Okay, we're getting a lot of questions now. So
You may want to move on to the
Nata is suggesting we move on, or let me just deal with a couple of more quickly, and then there's this question on why are the reasons for hunger when warehouses are overflowing. That's a very good question. I think, and I was going to put in the next slide saying that if people are hungry, it's not because there's lack of food, but because there's lack of justice. That either people don't have access to them because they can't buy the food grains, and or their own systems of self-provisioning have been destroyed, either by displacement or through the Green Revolution kind of models. And which is why we have this crazy situation of actually having enough food grains being produced, but a very large section of population going hungry or malnourished. Anusha's problem of Monsanto. So yeah, I think what's interesting is if you look at the trend from the 1960s, the initial trend was towards the centralization of agricultural development and policies in government institutions, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research and so on and so forth. And to some extent, because they were public institutions, there was still a certain public spirit of, okay, we're doing this for the people. What's happened 91 or mid 90s onwards is an increasing domination of private sector, private corporations, and also a combination of the government and the private sector in agricultural research and development. And so therefore, the increasing domination of companies like Monsanto, which has come in. And that's a very clear and continuing threat to India's food sovereignty. And I will get into the issue of what is food sovereignty, because I think that's very, very important also. Because the way the government looks at food sovereignty and self-reliance is very different from the way in which communities and farmers look at it. So, okay, there's lots. So, Chella, how do you suggest? Should I answer some more, or?
You can perhaps continue with your presentation, and then
we can bank on these questions and come back to them later.
Okay, can you keep track of them, because I might lose track of them.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so just a quick comment on and something that I've already partly mentioned in response to the questions is, when we ask the question, do we have alternatives? Was the Green Revolution a necessary evil? Or even now, what's being pushed in the form of agricultural development, including contract farming and so on, is it a necessary evil? Is there no other way of doing things? In order to answer that question, I think we have to also ask ourselves a more fundamental question of alternatives to what? Now, for instance, if you take the Food Security Act in India, it is in a sense an alternative, in the sense saying if people are going hungry, the government has the responsibility and the accountability to make sure there's adequate food available for people who are hungry, who can't buy it, or who for some reason or the other don't have access to adequate nutritious food. To my mind, that's an important approach, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But a more fundamental approach would be to say, why are people hungry in the first place? Why do people not have access to adequate nutritional food in the first place. And to get there, I think we have to answer we have to address the structural roots of the problem. I'm talking about hunger here, but it could be anything else. Absolute poverty, it could be injustices of various kinds. And this is where what I said earlier, I think, is very important, that we're talking about um, the roots of the problem, of the multiple problems that we have, lying in structures of inequality, structures of the concentration of power in the hands of a few over others. Whether it's capitalist corporations in terms of the way our economy runs or our consumption patterns, etc., we all are subject to that. Or it's state domination, where there's centralized socialist economies, such as what India has been in the past, or many others that we see around the world, where power is concentrated in the politicians and the bureaucrats. Or it's patriarchy, like I said, where it's the men who are largely taking the decisions, or it's in terms of casteism, racism, and so on. And finally, also, and very importantly, in terms of human beings and their domination over the earth, over all of other species, and the impacts of that we see. And so, therefore, alternatives have to be sought in terms of fundamental justice, of the redistribution of power, of the flattening of who takes decisions for what and why. And here there are, I think, two broad trends of the alternatives. One is those movements that resist this kind of imposition of unjust systems. This picture here is actually showing a demonstration from 30 years back of Adivasis in central India on the Indravati River against two mega hydro projects that would have displaced some 200-300 villages and destroyed a lot of forest and all their agricultural systems and everything. They protested against it successfully. Those dams were never built. But what was interesting about this also was the narrative that was coming out of that demonstration was not simply about we will be displaced and we don't want to be displaced, but also cultural, ethical, spiritual, in the sense that this river for you is about creating megawatts in power. For us, it's our mother. Our land is our mother. Our seeds are sacred to us. Now, this kind of notion, which is there in a lot of traditional communities, and in fact, in many of us also in some way or the other, is something that is completely neglected in development policy. It's like, okay, it's unscientific, it's superstitious, blah, 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 all of that. Whereas, in fact, for a lot of people, it is very important. And I would argue that, in fact, it is central to be able to live in peace with the earth. But resistance is also about protesting against land grabs, for instance. What's happening in the name of energy development, or happening in the name of highways, greater mobility and so on, or the bullet train, or whatever it is that we're seeing where farmers and Adivasis and others are protesting. Fisheries, the artisanal fisheries across the coast have been in movement for the last 40 years against the destruction of coastal ecosystems, and also against the introduction of mechanized trawling and other kinds of technologies in the fisheries sector, which benefit only the large fisher people or corporations, exposing the problems with chemicals. One of the few good proposals that's to come from the current government is to ban 17 or 27 pesticides amongst the more hazardous pesticides that are in use right now. I hope that goes through. There's a lot of opposition from the pesticide industry, but hopefully that will go through, and we should be actually phasing out all chemicals from agriculture and replacing them with organic techniques. So, so this kind of resistance movement, to my mind, is also very much part of the alternatives. But at the same time, we see that resistance gets immediate hitback from the powers that be. This is the latest one. It's funny if it wasn't tragic, which is where the Crop Care Federation of India, which is basically pesticide manufacturers, have put out an ad, a huge ad, which specifically names, and as you can see also illustrates, a few of the agricultural activists that have been taking up issues of the hazards of pesticides and GMOs and so on, and arguing on behalf of organic sustainable agriculture. And they've given all kinds of details of how these people are foreign funded and frauds and lying and blah, 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 blah. And so many of us face this challenge, this charge that when we dissent, when we exercise our democratic right to dissent, we get labeled with being anti-development or urban Naxals or pawns in the hands of foreign foreign interests. And that's this last one is actually very, very interesting, because the same government that actually has fallen completely hook, line, and sinker and blindly followed a foreign model of development and is still largely doing the same thing and inviting all kinds of foreign corporations into India, etc., is accusing us of being foreign pawns. So it's heights of irony that you can see these days. But along with resistance, therefore, it's also very important to talk about what are the constructive ways by which people are trying to meet needs and aspirations, because we're not simply saying, okay, leave us alone. Our lifestyles are fine, because they're not. There are lots of traditional problems. There is hunger, there is deprivation, there is inequality, there's casteism, etc. So we need also constructive solutions for how to do things, how to increase food grains production, for instance, without causing the kinds of problems that the Green Revolution has done. So over the last few years, my organization and many others have been documenting these alternatives on the ground, what people are themselves are coming up with. And I'm going to give you a few examples of these over the next few minutes. For me, one of the most inspiring is this group of about 4,000, 5,000 Dalit women farmers in Telangana, who, as Dalit women, were facing the same problems of hunger and deprivation that Dalit people do across the country, social ostracization, etc. But in the last 30 years, because of collectivization, forming women's sanghas in each of about 75 villages, going back to their traditional seeds of millets and rice and so on, creating grain banks in every village, securing land rights for the women, which is very unusual in India, and many other things, even creating their own local public distribution system so that local people have cheap access to healthy, organic jawar, bajra, and so on. They have created an incredible revolution in agriculture. They have claimed and have achieved what they call food sovereignty or Anna Swaraj. And I think it's very important here to point out the difference between food sovereignty and food security. Like I already mentioned, we have a Food Security Act, but what it does is it tries to make the government accountable to us, those of us who are facing starvation or hunger or whatever, and that's good. But food sovereignty is an approach where I can self-provision. I can make sure that as a farmer, I have full control over everything to do with food. That is the land, the water, the seeds, and the knowledge, rather than being dependent on somebody outside. And for these women, this was a very, very crucial difference or distinction that they have made. Here's an example of somebody whose farm I went to about 3 or 4 years back. This was a year in which they had 30% less rainfall than normal. It's already a dry area of Telangana. But despite that, in 3 acres, she was growing 45 varieties and species of crops, had enough food for a whole year for her family of, I think, 7 or 8 people, and still enough to sell in the market for 2 lakh rupees at an expense of 18,000. Completely organic, completely local seeds, no external inputs, no government support, nothing. Now, I'm not suggesting that Vinodamma can be replicated everywhere in India, but the fact of the matter is that amongst the most difficult of situations, you have examples like this, which suggest to us that the Green Revolution was a completely unnecessary and wasteful way to go. The same organization has tried to create some localized exchanges with people there. They are linking it, as I said, to a public distribution system. They also very, very clearly and explicitly say that agriculture is not just an economic system. It's also a cultural system. It's a system in which we will pray to our land and our seeds. We hold them culturally and spiritually sacred. And it's a culture. So agriculture in its multiple ways. And very interestingly, DDS, the same women who are facing hunger 30 years back or 25 years back, are today contributing to the district relief fund, something like 10,000 kilos of food grains and 1,000 glasses of porridge drink every day in Zahirabad town to municipal health workers, police workers, and and other people who are dealing with the COVID crisis. Another example, this one is from Bihar, where a village which was completely switched to chemical farming about a decade back has in the last 7 or 8, 9 years switched to 100% organic with the help of Greenpeace India and others. And they did it very slowly, like 1 or 2 farmers were convinced and said, okay, we're going to try it on some of our land. And slowly, as the results showed, they've done, the whole village has been converted. And again, during COVID time, no food insecurity here, but in fact, they're providing food for the relief measures in other parts of that area. Oops. A third example, this is an individual, Natwa Bhai Sarangi, quite old now, must be in his 80s, but still quite active, who was a chemical farmer till about 15 years back. He saw one of his own laborers dying because of pesticide poisoning. He also saw lots of dead frogs and fish and so on. And through all of that, there was a transformation in his head. And he said, no, I need to see whether I can actually go back to organic farming. He then traveled around all of Odisha and Chhattisgarh and found 400 varieties of rice that could be grown organically. He's been trying them out in small plots of land and then distributing them to surrounding farmers, saying that forget about hybrids, forget about fertilizers and pesticides, grow these, they will give you enough productivity. And he's in fact shown as high levels of productivity as with the chemicals. In the Northeast, this group of women, very, very inspiring group, is working in 3 states. In Nagaland, in villages like Chizami and elsewhere, they have also either sustained or revived a lot of their own diversity of millets and rice and so on, switched completely to organic, and linked up the agricultural and food production with other livelihoods like crafts or processing, etc. And trying to again create a more self-reliant economy based on this. In the Western Ghats, this group called Vanastri, again mostly women, are reviving a lot of their traditional varieties of vegetables and fruits, which are normally neglected. Most people talk about food grains only, but here they're trying to bring back tubers and tree crops and so on, and also revive the practice of home gardens, which was such an important part of food security for people and was destroyed in many different ways. So that's bringing that back so that women have control again over food in different ways. Similarly, there are movements on trying to see how pastoralism, which is very, very highly threatened across India, especially nomadic pastoralism is very threatened, how that can be brought back. So in Kutch, for instance, movements by the Maldharis and other pastoralists to see how camel diversity in populations can be retained, including with new things like trying to market camel milk, and that's actually now been picked up by Amul and others. But also to have rights over the pastures, because that's so important. So for instance, for the whole of the Banni grasslands in Kutch, they have claimed community forest rights to say that it's the Maldharis that should have primary access and governance control over these, and not to allow industries and agricultural expansion in what should be grasslands. So that's many different movements of pastoralists. Sustaining wild foods. This is something that we do with forest communities very close to Pune in a wildlife sanctuary, where we've been having every 6 months or so a wild foods festival. And women, mostly it's women who actually have knowledge about this, have been recollecting a lot of the wild foods from the forest, making really tasty meals out of them. And we get people from cities like Pune to actually go and taste them and see and be able to respect that kind of knowledge. All of this is also what is very important in all of this also is the underlying factors of who controls the resources on which all of this is based. So movements are trying to reclaim the ecological commons, such as forests, become also very, very important, because without that, you don't have access anymore to wild foods or to ingredients that you might need for your agriculture also. So this is a movement in Gadchiroli of 90 villages forming a Mahagram Sabha, federation of Gram Sabhas, to stop mining, but also to reclaim their own Adivasi identities, to protect the forest and use it sustainably. And again, in COVID times, it's very interesting, but because they've been able to do this and they've been able to create a community fund from the forest resources, that even migrant workers who had to come back to the villages and didn't have any livelihoods, the villages were able to sustain them in these last 2, 3, 4 months without having to seek government aid. Many hundreds of examples of people doing similar things of protecting their natural ecosystems because they know how so very important it is for their own food security. But then we also have examples where people have moved into trying to see how can you be a little bit more in control of the economy also, not just in terms of your own lives and your food and your natural ecosystems and so on, but also the economy. So for instance, farmers and what they get in the market is a huge issue. As an individual farmer, I have very little control over what kind of prices I get in the market. But if I form a producer company or a cooperative, I could have the strength of 2,000 farmers behind me to be able to negotiate a much better deal, to do my own branding, etc. Not corporate kind of branding, but my own identity. Okay, this is Dharni organic produce, which is being produced by farmers in Andhra Pradesh with the help of Timbuktu Collective. And also to make sure that the proceeds from that are distributed equitably. It's not like some capitalists will get lots of money from this and other farmers will stay where they are, but that everybody is kind of sharing the proceeds in some kind of fair and just manner. It's very crucial also, the question that was raised earlier about 45% of India being urban. It's absolutely important, therefore, also to start talking about how urban mindsets can be changed. How do we look at food? How do we look at agriculture? Do we even respect the farmers whose food we eat? Do we even know where our food is coming from? Do we even try and grow some of our own food? And again, there's some very interesting movements. In Bangalore, for instance, more than 10,000 people with rooftop or backyard farming and exchange programs and festivals and all that they organize there. Or increasing connections between farmers, organic farmers and consumers. For instance, Deccan Development Society, the Dalit women farmers I spoke about, they run a program called Corn Farm with 100 consumers in Hyderabad committing upfront to 10,000 rupees a year to be given to the woman farmer, who will then commit to making sure that there's a supply of organic produce that comes to that family. But more than the economic thing, it's the social relationship that gets built up. The consumers then going and actually being with the farming family coming to Hyderabad and being with them. And you start actually breaking down the kind of divisions that exist between producer and consumer, between urban and rural, and so on, creating more of a social relationship, so to speak. Many initiatives also at non-profit things. So for instance, OFM, Organic Farmers Market in Chennai, which is I think some 15, 16. Chella and Sujata will know more about it. Places where farmers can actually come and sell things and get all the proceeds. It's not being cornered by middlemen. So many things like that. And then of course, more collective people's movements. I don't know if somebody from Makam, Soma or somebody is on this call, but they can tell us more, or from Asha. These are more national or regional level networks that try and take a lot of these different alternatives, resistance plus alternatives forward in terms of advocacy, in terms of networks, exchanging information and knowledge, and so on. And finally, before I get to the framework, to say that when all this happens and there's enough pressure and advocacy and showing practical ways of doing things, you do have also chinks within the system where you can create some kind of right kind of policies or programs. Food Security Act was a step in the right direction, not adequate. I think there are fundamental flaws with it, including what I mentioned earlier, but nevertheless, something at least try and make the government accountable. The Forest Rights Act, in paper at least, pretty remarkable, very bad implementation. The same government that brought it in did not want its implementation. I can see Ashok Da on this, and he can tell us more about the problems on the ground. But where it has been possible to implement with adequate people's mobilization, you can see a huge change taking place in terms of the governance of the forest commons, and with that also agriculture and so on, or programs of organic farming. Now, 16 states or more actually have these programs. There are many problems with these. Sikkim's 100% organic, for instance, is sounds good, but there's a very heavy orientation on marketing and on commercialization and exports, which creates its own problems. But there are other states which have worked somewhat progressively on this. In the COVID times, I think with regard to food, one of the most remarkable things has been how civil society has stepped up. Obviously not adequately, because the scale of the problem is so massive. But without this, you would still have had millions of more people who would not have had enough food, or who would not have been able to tide over this huge crisis in the last 3 or 4 months. It's a crisis not so much because of COVID, but because of the way in which the lockdown has been imposed. And I think that's something that's really worth looking at. We've got many examples of that on this blog spot. And I'll talk about another initiative that's just been started on this at the end. I don't want to miss out on talking about the fact that these kinds of movements or of alternatives and resistance are found across the world. I obviously don't have time to go into all of these. We have a book which I'll show you right at the end, which has 100 examples from different parts of the world. But broadly, with respect to our current topic, agroecology as a movement, with many, many, many different ways of expressing it on the ground. For instance, in Bangladesh, there's something called Naya Krishi, which is several tens of thousands of farmers who have completely switched to local seeds, organic, collective working, etc., etc., and many others across the world. And I think it's very important that we are doing cross-learning and connecting these different movements around the world so that there's a greater critical mass and push for macro change. Let me end this framework presentation by talking about what I think is a more holistic way of looking at this. As I keep emphasizing, food and agriculture cannot be looked at in isolation from politics and economy and so on. So what I see, the kinds of transformations people are trying on the ground or and arguing for conceptually, and what I've learned from them, is that we're talking about fundamental change in 5 different spheres of life. So the Mahagram Sabha in Kochi that I mentioned is saying that the decisions that are to be taken for these 90 villages should be taken by these 90 villages. Hamare gaon mein hum hi sarkar. Even as we make the government accountable for things, services that it should be providing us, but we will, at least for basic needs, we should be taking our own decisions. That's a form of radical democracy. Actually, that's democracy in its real sense, power of the people, not power of politicians and bureaucrats who we elect. But that then goes beyond also looking at, especially if you're looking at agriculture, for instance, agricultural ecosystems are not the same, don't have the same boundaries as our political boundaries. So political boundaries don't respect agroecological zones and cultural zones and so on. So you can have a Sundarbans as a place for fisheries and so on being cut across by a national boundary, which was nothing to do with the fishing communities there. They didn't necessarily want that kind of a national boundary. It's whoever is taking those political decisions. The same you can see across South Asia. So you talk about radical democracy, you have to start actually even questioning current political boundaries from an ecological and a cultural perspective. The second crucial thing is economic democracy. What the Dalit women farmers of Telangana are saying, if it's food, if it's water, if it's knowledge, anything to do with our economy, with our basic means of production, it should be in our control, not controlled by the government or by corporations. So producer sovereignty, much better links between producers and consumers, bringing back the economy of caring and sharing. One of their most important principles is when food is produced, it'll be the first priority to that is for people at home. Only after that, into the market. And we see that a lot of agricultural development is actually completely the other way around. You produce for the market and then you go and buy stuff in the market, which is usually very poor quality. The third important thing is social justice and well-being. I don't want to underemphasize the fact that India's casteism, gender inequalities, and all of that has to be a very core element of the struggles. As environmentalists, sometimes we've been very weak on that, and we've taken hits. And I think it's very important that we recognize the fact that uh, that this exists as a very, very central part of, and it's been there for hundreds of years or thousands of years. And also that therefore a solution that might exist in, say, Adivasi India and central India may not necessarily work in a caste-ridden village somewhere else, right? What happens there may not work, for instance, in Uttar Pradesh. And sure, Shogda will talk about that in his comments, because there's enormous caste and gender issues which have to be dealt with, or other kinds of issues that have to be dealt with. So we need to be able to figure out social justice struggles also. The fourth sphere is culture and knowledge. I keep emphasizing the fact that the knowledge that the agricultural communities and forestry communities have is at the core of this kind of alternatives and sustaining and justice and so on. That doesn't mean it's enough. We may need to supplement it with other knowledge systems, but that has to be the base to build on. And the cultural aspects relating to that, and the methods of transmission, the intergenerational transmissions, etc., all of that is really, really important element of transformation. And finally, of course, the fifth sphere is of ecology, because without sustaining the environment, we're all dead anyway, however powerful or rich or knowledgeable we might be. And underlying all of this, Asim and I have called it Prakritik Swaraj or radical ecological democracy. It's a very simple idea that wherever we are the decision makers. Whether there is a state or not, if there is a state, we make it accountable, but we have to be the primary decision makers. And that is not about a village community alone. It could be an urban ward or urban neighborhood. It could be a school or a college or whatever. That students in a college, for instance, like IIT, should be part of decision making and not just the management. And these days, even the faculty is not part of the decision making, right? But even as we are the decision makers or are central to the decision making, we are also responsible to other people and their autonomy and freedom, and also to other species. So that brings in ecological and social responsibility in this. And I'm going to end this section here with this set of this slide talking about values, because to me, what all of these examples bring out is at the core a very different set of ethics and principles than what the dominant system tells us. For instance, number 4 here is that we can make all these transformations happen if we cooperate and work as a collective, rather than if we are selfish and work as an individual. Okay, the group photograph and not the selfie, if you want to take a photography allegory to it. Or you take something like the fifth one, we all ask for our rights, and I think that's crucial. But along with rights also come responsibilities towards others and other species, other people and other species. The notion of self-reliance and autonomy and freedom. And I'll come back to the self-reliance in a bit, because that's the buzzword these days from our commander-in-chief. So I do want to dwell on that for a minute. So I think if I was to show only one slide, this would be the one, because it, to my mind, is about transforming values, bringing back some of the older values which are still relevant, and new ones that maybe we think are important, and positing these against the dominant system, which is completely the opposite of all of this. We got multiple challenges. We talk about organic farming, but we know that in our cities, especially, organic farming is usually very expensive. So how can we make organic, healthy food available to the urban poor is a big challenge. And there are, again, examples where this is happening with, say, millets in Bangalore and elsewhere, but that's big. Can we attempt to do that partly by arguing for the shifting of chemical fertilizer subsidy into organic, but only temporarily, because we can't have a permanently subsidized system which will create a new kind of dependence. But certainly we have to ask, why are there 80,000 crore rupees of subsidies on chemical fertilizers? It doesn't make any sense. I've already mentioned about the challenge of food security versus food, not versus, but in relation to food sovereignty, and the fact that a lot of young people are not interested in agriculture anymore for good reason. We can't blame them. But the way agriculture itself has been emaciated and destroyed and become non-remunerative, why should young people get into it? So how do we actually create the incentives for young people, including from those who are not in agricultural systems right now, to actually get into agriculture? Um, and right now is an amazing time because so many millions of people have gone back. I think the Northeast Network, for instance, was telling us the other day. In fact, we have a webinar with them on the 8th of August, where they're saying that people are actually, a lot of young people who come back to the villages are currently working in the Zoom fields with their elders, and they're learning. And some of them are beginning to say, maybe this is something I want to continue doing and not go back to the city where I have such an insecure job. So the possibility of actually creating the incentives on the ground for young people also to continue this. We still have the challenge of huge corporate takeover, including in Atmanirbhar Bharat, there's this whole thing of contract farming. I mean, I don't know how they can call that self-reliance, just doesn't make sense at all. And then linking health and food. And again, in COVID, this has become such an important thing where you see community initiatives at community health. They're trying to link local organic farming with healthy bodies and healthy systems, such as in the tribal health initiative in Sitalingi in Tamil Nadu. So I'm going to stop there again. And the last few slides, I think will take just 5 minutes for me. So maybe I'll stop here and then we can, or should I just finish and then we can?
I think it's better to finish if you've just got a few slides.
All right. So the last few is basically just talking about networking process that that many groups have initiated to try and bring together. Because one of the problems we face is we're very fragmented. Lots of initiatives that are taking place, but not necessarily connected. Lots of initiatives in different sectors, so agriculture and gender and health and education, but again, not cutting across these sectors. So Vikalp Sangam is a platform we started about 6 years back to try and bridge these gaps, to try and have people working with each other, constructively challenging each other, helping each other to become more comprehensive, more holistic, more deep. And this involves physical gatherings and confluences. For instance, we've had 2 on food justice and food sovereignty and so on. Or we've had it on health, on education, on democracy, etc. But also regional sangams where people in that region come together to see what kind of alternatives are already happening and what more needs to be done. Within this process, we've just initiated a couple of weeks back and we still haven't even sent the announcements out. So you're amongst the first people to hear about it. Apart from all the networks we've been in touch with, which is that there's been so much civil society and community mobilization around COVID relief. Can we in some way move that into also talking about medium and long-term measures for livelihoods, dignified livelihoods? So like I mentioned, millions of people going back to the villages. How can we create the opportunities for them or help them to create their own opportunities for dignified livelihoods wherever they are, whether in a village or in a city? Rights of workers, which has been so badly bruised in this COVID time, and even now the kind of weakening of labor laws that we see. So advocacy against that, advocacy for workers' rights. And through all of that, envisioning more self-reliant, more localized, more just, more ecologically sustainable economy. So this is a process that's already involved some 20, 30 networks around the country. Many more that we hope will get involved so that it becomes a national level process of exchange, of creating the platforms and the opportunities for this kind of thing to happen. I'd be happy to respond to questions on that. So that's a website on which we have many case studies and stories. I think about 1,500 stories of alternatives around the country, including many on, in fact, I think the maximum are on food and agriculture and pastoralism and so on. And I mentioned books. I just want to put, so the one in the middle is the one which has a sort of 100 examples from around the world of radical alternatives. The one on the left, Alternative Futures, is where 40 people have dreamed of what could be an ideal future for India in 2100. and then come back down to earth and say, okay, what are the challenges of getting there? What pathways, what already exists, what more has to be done? And the right side one is 9 detailed case studies of alternative transformation in India, including some of the examples that I've given. So that's it from my side. My email, so this is my old email, but it still works if anybody wants to be in touch with me later. So I'm going to stop sharing and then we can have a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Inspiring as always. I'm just going to, I've been looking at the questions, and what I see are mostly comments, but there are a few interesting questions. Let me sort of quickly point out a couple. So one is from Amit Wahane. He says, I guess what is being done by Rice organization in Andhra Pradesh is revolutionary in this area, where climate change is the main issue. Organic farming should be slowly implemented. So that's again more of a comment, but you may want to respond to that. Kunatur Srinivas Reddy on controlling farming as water distribution to offset droughts and floods, and restoration of water bodies across the country. Another comment again. But then there's a question from Govind. Do you think that organic farmer collectives should not scale up their production to target foreign markets? So this is an interesting question for me also, because I just came across a discussion in the Journal of Peasant Studies from about 6 years ago, when there was a conversation between La Via Campesina and several academic scholars from around the world. I don't know if you were involved as well with that conversation, but where basically La Via Campesina was responding to questions and also raising questions for academics. And one of these had to do with this question of how do you link up with questions of trade, of imports, of how do you deal with this whole political economy, the international political economy. So I think that might be something to touch upon as well.
I think if you look at the fundamental principles of agroecology, and I'm mentioning agroecology as an umbrella term, like I said, it's called all kinds of different things in different parts of the world. There are many fundamental principles. Of course, the first one is you have to be respectful of your own ecological limits. So what your land can provide, how much water you have, seeds, etc., etc. But the second or third is also that production should first and foremost be for domestic consumption. Domestic doesn't necessarily in my own family. It could be, say, my community, my village, or whatever. Before I even think of the market, because that's the only way I can ensure food security for myself. If I say that, okay, I will grow only tobacco on my land so that I can get a lot of money and then I can buy the food. Well, tomorrow COVID might happen or something else might happen. I may not even have access to that food anymore. Today, the villages that have been most able to cope with COVID in terms of food is those where they have had movements for food sovereignty and food security, such as Deccan Development Society, Northeast Network, and so on. So that's a very crucial principle of agroecology, including organic farming. The third thing to look at here is, or an extension of the first one, ecological impacts. Now, when you think of doing organic farming or producing organic food for export, you might be meeting the tastes and the requirements of somebody in Europe, okay, who wants organic millets from Andhra Pradesh, for instance. But the food miles or the ecological footprint of that in terms of the travel from Andhra Pradesh to England is so huge, somebody somewhere is paying that cost. Whether it's the climate impacts of that because you've flown that or shipped it or whatever, and there's fossil fuels being used, or it's other kinds of impacts that are. And so, is that what we want to look at? And that's why there's a big question mark on Sikkim's model of 100% organic, because a lot of it is focused on exports, whether exports to other cities in India or exports outside India. Or should we say that, look, we've got 130 million people in India, 1.3 billion people, probably soon to become 1.4 or 1.5 billion. can we first not say that the organic produce in India should be for these 1.3 billion people? First and foremost for my own community and surrounds, and then for others. Why should we think about exports? To my mind, it doesn't make sense to have food. I'm not talking about things like coffee and tea. Fine, okay, that if there is trade in that, if it's insofar as it's not undermining my food security, it's okay. But food, as in food grains or fruits and vegetables and so on, to my mind, has to be targeted to our own domestic audience. And I'm not being nationalistic here. I'm not saying, okay, national boundaries kind of thing. Okay, if somebody in Bangladesh needs it, that's certainly part of the same, in that sense, agroecological system. But exporting to Europe, and I mean, like what Latin American farmers are doing, or some big farmers like exporting quinoa to Europe, because quinoa has suddenly become fashionable in US and Europe. But that has jacked up the prices in Latin America itself so much that local people are not able to consume quinoa anymore, who used to have it cheap or free. So I think we have to be very careful about this whole export thing. And I think Via Campesina, I'm sure, must have been asking these questions of the academics, if that was part of that discussion, Chala.
Yeah. So other questions having to do with scaling up organics, and do you think that this is an issue that needs further discussion, or should we keep things local? And then some very specific questions. Yeah, there's another interesting question from Swaminathan about the role of education in transforming to sustainable agriculture, and a few more below, which I'll come to next.
Okay, and before I forget the first one about water, I think that comment is also very, very, very important. India is already 70% of India is in a water crisis situation. Either too much water or too little water, and mostly too little. And so therefore, and agriculture being a very large consumer of water and energy, all these alternatives that we're talking about become really important. So what Vinodamma shows is possible in dry land with rainfall, no artificial irrigation. That's the kind of the sort of dryland sorts of techniques that we have to be able to spread. And there is a movement, dryland farming movement in India, which is trying to do exactly that. So yes, water becomes a really important part of this. Scaling up. So I've always taken the approach that scaling up is the wrong way to go. It's a very corporate or very government, and some NGO models. Okay, some NGOs also want to become bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's the same with corporations. What I say we need to do is scale out. By that I mean that if we've got these 5,000 Dalit women farmers who have shown a particular model of food sovereignty, learn from them, and another community of 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 farmers does something similar, but it's not Deccan Development Society, it's their own cooperative or company or sanstha or sangathan or whatever they want to create, and they interact with each other to learn from each other. And they modify things for their own agroecological and economic and conditions and cultural conditions. So to me, and that's the scaling out. So you then create bigger and bigger and bigger networks, and bigger and bigger and bigger and more organic productions and healthy production, but without having this one single entity that becomes huge and monstrous and then becomes bureaucratic and tries to control all of. And this is exactly why we have to be very wary of corporations coming into organic now, because they have the scale potential, unfortunately, and they can easily do over lakhs of hectares, but they will be displacing every single small farmer in those lakhs of hectares. And the objective of social justice and equality will be completely out of the window. So I think environmentalists also have to be very careful about what kind of models or examples we're talking about, where the social and economic and political becomes as important as the ecological. So that's the scaling up thing. And here, sorry, I should mention here that apart from networking of community institutions and civil society and all of that, government policy then also becomes very important. Insofar as we have a state, we need to make the state accountable to having policies that support organic farming, but support them in ways that use these agroecological principles I mentioned, not support them for export, etc. So, okay, some of what's happening in Andhra, some of what's happening in Kerala, etc., is worth looking at, because in fact there you do have, or Odisha with millets, is you do have sensitive bureaucrats and politicians who have actually taken somewhat progressive positions once in a while to be able to sensitively support the spread of organic and biodiverse farming. So that's important also. Education, absolutely, and I think this is in multiple ways. One is, I know that when I was growing up in school, farming was always considered a primitive job, and it probably is even more so now in the kind of schooling that we have. So it's always the aspirations that we are given as children are about becoming, in those days it was about becoming a scientist in a government institution or IAS bureaucrat or whatever it is. Now it's maybe IT, or I don't know what all aspirations kids have these days. But almost never is our education system telling us that, look, doing things on the land, getting our hands so-called dirty, actually clean, uh, is is as respectable as sitting on a computer. I remember a remark by a handicraft, a handloom, a young handloom weaver in Kutch, must be about 25, 26 years old, who's continuing to do his traditional family occupation of weaving carpets. And I asked him, I said, look, you're educated. You could have easily gone into IT or something else like some of your friends seem to have. Why didn't you go? He very proudly said, my loom is my computer. I'm very creative on it. I have to think constantly. And if anything, you guys on your computer, you're doing cut, mechanical stuff. I'm actually doing stuff that's creative. I can get up whenever I want. I'm with my family. I'm in complete control of my time and my products and so on. How do we instill that kind of pride in different kinds of livelihoods? And that has to come at the level of school. But the second crucial thing here is, what do we consider even as food that's worthy of eating, since we're talking about food and agriculture? Again, I grew up, though in my family it was a little different, but I grew up in a milieu in which we were already thinking that wheat and rice is the only good stuff to eat. Jawar, bajra, ragi, no, all coarse grains. Even the name coarse grains, usko chhod do. No, don't get into that. Let's have polished wheat and polished rice. And that comes again from school time. Now, why can't we have all schools, let's say all government schools across the country, saying we will procure locally, we will eat the millets that are grown locally, we will eat the local rice varieties, we'll encourage the farmers to actually give it to us, we'll procure it locally, our midday meals will only have that and not polished wheat and rice coming from UP and so on. And that creates an interest in kids also. It's tasty. It's not like it's tasteless stuff, no? So I think we need multiple kinds of changes in our education system in order for these revolutions to take place also.
Ashish, there's a question about managing the supply chain.
The what? The what in the supply chain?
The skills of communities in terms of managing the entire supply chain.
Yeah, I think this is where example like Timbuktu might be interesting to look at, because the one that I showed you about the Dharni producer company, because there I think about 3,000 farmers, if I'm not mistaken, got together and formed, with the help of this NGO Timbuktu Collective, to form a producer company, created their own brand and their own ways of packaging things like that. It's all organic. And through that, they are actually able to, right from the cultivation to the marketing, they worked out the entire chain, and they're in control of that. Of course, once the produce is given to a shop in Bangalore or Hyderabad or whatever, beyond that, they don't have the control. But we can get there also. There's no reason why, for instance, producer companies can't also have their own retail things, or have relationships like in Chennai, the OFM, the Organic Farmers Market and Restore and so on, where you build a relationship with the retail, which is such that 95% of the proceeds go back to you as a farmer, rather than profits being maintained by you. So I think that's the way in which the entire supply chain from cultivation to the end can be worked out. It's also happening with crafts. The same handloom thing in Kutch that I was mentioning, they've actually, Khamir, the group there, has worked with the weavers to work the entire chain from cultivation of organic Kala cotton to the production of the cloth and products of cloth, and then the marketing. So I think we need to do much more of that. But in order to do that, we also then have to resist and fight against the big retail giants that are taking over, that have taken over or are taking over. And this I include things like Fab India. I'm sorry I'm naming them, but in the name of doing things differently, unfortunately, that's also become just another corporate brand with huge profit making.
Ashish, there's a question from Prasannan Parthasarthi. He says, have the successful agricultural efforts that you described, have they also undertaken ecosystem restoration?
Yes, Prasanna. Many of them have had to, because especially if you're shifting from being chemical to trying to be organic again, then it's a gradual process of, like Natwar Sarangi example I gave you from Odisha. He was completely chemical. So it took him 3-4 years to actually nurse the land back into its own productive energy and elements, nutrients and so on. And in different parts, different agroecological conditions, you'll probably need different approaches. Like I said, I'm not a food or agricultural expert, so I can't get into that too much. But what I've learned from these people is that they have their own approach. So some people use organic manure, cow dung, for instance. Others use things from the forest or whatever is locally available. And here's another very important thing of public policy, because in a lot of places, those organic nutrients don't exist anymore. Either the forest is gone, there are no more cows or other livestock, etc. And so we also need processes of either civil society and community networking to enable those organic nutrients to be made available, or we need public policy support in something like that. And that's what I'm saying. So 80,000 crores of rupees in chemical fertilizers, if you started shifting that into providing organic inputs, for instance, where farmers don't have them anymore, you'd see a huge change taking place. So yeah, and there's also been restoration of wetlands, because with, as I said, water is such an important thing. There's been restoration of forests, because they know that the inflows from forest in nutrients and water and so on are so important for their agriculture. So there are multiple examples of ecological restoration, yes.
Ashish, these very powerful lobbies that we have, groups that have benefited from this dominant paradigm of agriculture in India. So the, like the fertilizer companies, pesticide companies, various things, how are we going to, what is your thinking about our ability to be able to successfully actually win this long battle that is ensuing on actually making, making this alternative models for agriculture move more to the center in our development model? Because
So
that's where the biggest challenge lies, So
yeah.
how are we going to actually oppose them?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges. The other very big one is our own mindsets. Like I keep saying, the cultural issue, what we think of as food worthy of eating, etc., how we relate to farmers. I mean, there's so many mindset and cultural issues also. But yes, this is a huge one. As a one of the, let's say, the silver linings that I see to that advertisement that I showed you, which has targeted Kavita and others by the pesticide industry, is that the only reason they would have issued something like this is because they are actually shaken. And the reason they're shaken is because the movements against pesticides and for organic, or against GMOs and for organic, or for local indigenous seeds, is getting more and more strong. It is shaking both the government system that has been promoting the dominant green revolution model and the industrial whether it's the seed industry or the pesticides industry or the fertilizer industry. But at the moment, it's only shaking. It's not undermining or demolishing that industry. And so therefore, we have to, number one, do much more of networking with each other to become even more strong in terms of a national and a global lobby against chemicals and for organic. We have to do what global groups like Via Campesina do, which is to be able to take the fight right from the local to the international, to the FAOs and the UNs and so on and so forth. And that can only happen if there's lots of horizontal networking and linking up with each other, and also by vertical, I don't mean hierarchical, but like people who say work in the UN level and us on the ground and so on. That's one. The second is trying to encourage much more consumer change. And actually, as a consumer movement in India, we're very, very weak. Most of our consumer movements in India have been about prices and things like that. There's very little of a consumer movement on health. Now, why shouldn't health, especially these days, be a huge consumer movement where we say what we are eating, what we are consuming, what we are drinking, why is that not healthy? Why is that not pesticide free? Why is that not chemical free? Why does that have all kinds of preservatives and so on, which I can't even read the names of, I can't pronounce the names of, when in fact we do have viable alternatives to all of that, which is much more healthy. So I think we need to create that, which means messaging, communications. We need a whole dedicated, the BJP has this incredible dedicated social media unit. We need to emulate that, not the messaging that it does, but in terms of having the capacity in the civil society and community mobilizations where we can actually put these sorts of messages out there, whether it's on all the so-called social media or on the traditional media, conventional media. We've really not been doing a very good job at that. We've not been doing a very good job at getting across to people's hearts. A lot of our movements have been about minds, reaching people's minds, saying, okay, there's 33 point whatever micrograms per kilogram of pesticide in your food. That doesn't hit people. You have to be able to say things in ways that kind of reach people's emotions, hearts, not factually incorrect, but stated in very different ways. And I think so there's a whole lot of this kind of stuff that we would have to do in order to be able to challenge the industry by undermining its own support base, and of course also continuously hitting at the government for policy changes, for not supporting the industry as much as it does, etc. But that I'm not very hopeful that the government is very interested in listening to us right now, especially the central government. Some state governments are, so let's work at that level.
There's some questions around input costs for organics, and also sort of managing the inputs. Do you have some suggestions on that? And so it's also tied to scale. So I just kind of tried to summarize some of these comments.
So input costs, okay, so what are the 4 or 5 key inputs into an organic farming process? There's, let's take farming. I'm not talking about, say, pastoralism, etc. Right now, just farming, cultivation. There's seeds, there's water, there's land, and there's knowledge. And if necessary, some kind of pest control and nutrition or fertilization things, where if the land is not fertile enough, for instance. So let's say 5 things. Now, what we see in a lot of the initiatives that I spoke about is that actually if you're able to restore ecosystems and create collectives in which you can share with each other, those input costs go down considerably, sometimes zero. Like if you take Vinodamma's, her input cost for that year was 18,000 rupees. And that's only because at one point in time, her 3 acres of land had such a profusion of crops that she actually had to get labor from outside. And she earned 2 lakh rupees from that, apart from feeding her own family for the whole year. Now, so that should be the the approach. That should be the model. That actually input. In fact, there's a whole movement around the world called low input agriculture, LISA, low input agriculture, and so something. And even to some extent, though it's very controversial, and I don't know whether to support or not, but the zero budget approach of our farmer from Maharashtra, and then what the Andhra Pradesh government is currently adopting across the state. I'm not getting into the controversies of it right now, but again, the idea is that the farmer should be able to actually spend as little as possible, if not zero, and still get the output that he or she needs or wants. That, I think, is very important. What unfortunately has happened is that many of these inputs are no longer easily available. You might still therefore have to buy traditional seeds, or you might still have to buy organic, cow, but gobar, for instance. And this is where, again, I say that either you need civil society networks or you need the government policy support to enable that to happen. But it should happen in a way that the farmer eventually becomes self-reliant in even those inputs and not continuously dependent on. And when I say farmer, I don't necessarily mean the individual. It could be the farming, the women sangha, for instance, collectively becoming self-reliant on each of these inputs. So eventually it should be zero or minimal rupees as inputs.
So what about landless farmers? I mean, this is something Ashok Chaudhary's raised. How do we...
Yeah. So I think we need, and Ashok can speak more about that than I can. We obviously need to go back into our old approach, which we've forgotten long back, of land reforms, of looking at what kind of land distribution we have, who's controlling the land, the issue of the fact that a lot of Dalits or Adivasis may not have land at all, or women are not in control of the land, even if they might be cultivating it. So these are all fundamental structural issues of the way our society and economy is organized that we have to deal with. And I can, or who controls the forest, or who controls the water and the rivers and the lakes and so on. So these are all very fundamental issues of reorganizing land itself, or used to call it land reforms. Maybe there are other terms that are being used now. Nobody's talking about that anymore. In fact, the only land reforms that are taking place is where the maximum land limits, etc., are being done away with, so that corporations and others can take over. So it's going in the regressive direction. But I think it's also important that even with the best of land redistributions, agriculture alone will not sustain the entire set of livelihoods that need to be sustained in rural India, and certainly sustaining also food consumption in cities and so on. So we need, along with that, also the diversification of rural economies, so that it's agriculture, processing of agriculture-based products or forest-based products, etc., and other small-scale manufacturing and services, which can make an integrated economy, and especially those that can be accessed by the most marginal populations, the Dalits and the women and so on. So yeah, that fundamental political economy question has to be addressed, and I'm not quite sure how. I mean, there has to be struggles for that. I should just give an example here, which is a very interesting one, and again, not necessarily replicable across the country, is the village of Mendhalekha in Maharashtra, Gadchiroli, which has put its entire agricultural lands, which were privately owned, into the village commons through an act which came up around Vinoba or post Vinoba Bhave's movement on land, called the Gramdan Act. Now, the Gramdan Act is a very interesting one, where if villages put a substantial amount of their agricultural land into the commons, then they are entitled to greater government support. It's mostly not been implemented anywhere in the country, but here this village, after 10 years of discussion, actually has done that. And that doesn't mean that people, so the families that have been cultivating plots of land still cultivate the same plots. But now decisions with regard to, for instance, selling the land or making major transformations on the land have to be taken collectively, because it's all part of the commons. So that's another interesting way of dealing with it. And because of that, some who were landless could also then get access to land. And by the way, the Deccan Development Society people also, there were many women who were landless initially, but they were able to take over the fallow lands that had been left and then argue for rights to those fallow lands. So I think there's a number of different ways that would have to be dealt with. This would have to be dealt with.
So this raises a sort of a broader question, right, around land tenure. We don't have a system of the commons here like in England, but we do have revenue and non-revenue lands, roughly. And then whatever this vague category called wasteland, right? And are there places where wasteland is actually being reclaimed for sort of common property as for cultivation? Is that something that
common property for cultivation, I'm not sure, but common property for things like pasture or as small scale forest produce, yes. So Forest Rights Act is being used in some parts of India to be able to reclaim, because a lot of so-called wastelands are also classified as forest. They may not actually have forest on them, but they've been taken over by the forest department at some point or the other and have been classified. So you can actually use the Forest Act to claim those as commons, as village commons. But unfortunately, even in rural populations, a lot of the so-called wasteland, especially pasture land, has now got divided up into either private holdings or for other users, or been sold off with all kinds of Benami transactions to outsiders, and that's a huge problem. Like what I mentioned about the Banni pasture land in Kutch, which the Maldharis are trying to claim as common lands under the Forest Rights Act. There are two major threats there. One is a lot of that has been given to industries in Modi's time when he was chief minister, and still continues to be. And second is within their own communities, some of them have actually taken to agriculture, settled agriculture, and have carved out private agricultural plots within those commons. And so the Maldharis have filed a case last year against themselves. This might be unique in history. They have actually filed a case against themselves in the court saying all encroachments, including our own encroachments, on the pasture land should be removed. And we want to claim this as commons. So there's some interesting movements of that kind.
Before I forget, there's a question from Rajiv Barua, which is there a thought on paying farmers for ecosystem services? For instance, farmers who practice mulching, green manuring, organic farming, etc. And I would sort of extend that to say also for upstream services. So is there any thought of, cities paying people who are, doing eco-restoration upstream for their services, ecosystem services?
Yeah, I know of these arguments only in discussions. I don't know if there's any state in India, certainly not at the central level, that this is being argued as a policy proposal. I think it should be. We have argued in the past for instance, the Himalayan states getting extra revenues from the states of the plains, or from the central government, because the ecosystem functions provided by the Himalayan forests or the Himalayan ecosystems are huge for the entire plains, right? The entire Gangetic plains. Even the Planning Commission is actually the then Planning Commission has argued that, but this has really not gone anywhere. But yes, I think it's a valid argument to make. I think the way one could show how it's possible is through community-supported agriculture to start with. So the example I gave of Corn Farm, where 100 consumers in Hyderabad pay upfront 10,000 rupees for every family in Telangana, the Deccan Development Society, in a way is like that, because they're kind of supporting a organic farming system by making investments in it. So that's maybe one approach that one can use, but I don't know of any serious policy proposal on this, but it's certainly worth considering. Chala, you're mute.
Sorry. I said we'll end with this one, if it's okay with everyone, from Ranjini. And she asks, what do you think is the role of state biodiversity boards in terms of restoring local knowledge around agriculture and forest-based resources?
So the state biodiversity boards are set up under the Biodiversity Act. And the Biodiversity Act is an interesting legislation which does have possible provisions for making a lot of this happen, things that I've been talking about. And so the National Biodiversity Authority and state biodiversity boards can certainly be asked to support, for instance, smallholder, agrobiologically diverse farming, right? Because that's part of their mandate actually to do it. But there are many problems with this. And the second thing that I think the state biodiversity boards can also do is look at where are the regions, the hotspots of agricultural biodiversity and these kind of community systems, right? In fact, in the National Biodiversity Action Plan that we had done 20 years back, we had argued that this for not just wildlife protected areas, but also agroecology conservation areas managed by the communities, not by government departments, where especially, for instance, mining and dams and so on and so forth should simply not, or GMOs, etc., should simply, I mean, of course, it shouldn't happen across the country. But let's say to start with, we say, okay, these are especially important for the agricultural security of the country. And so these could be demarcated and governed in certain ways. So this is possible under the biodiversity heritage sites in the Biodiversity Act, and it's state biodiversity boards that are responsible for setting them up or for helping communities to set them up. Unfortunately, most state biodiversity boards have really not gone into agricultural diversity in any big way. There's been a lot of wildlife focus and things like that. Plus, they have very little money, actually. State biodiversity boards are really badly funded. Even if they wanted to do something substantial, it's not so easy. And something like the biodiversity heritage sites, there's some great guidelines on that, but they've been mostly ignored. And in fact, most of those state biodiversity boards are chaired by a forest department person. I have some great forest department friends, and there's some great forest officers out there doing fantastic work. But as a department, it still has the old mentality. So then I don't think we can expect very much in terms of a dramatic change. But the potential is there. I mean, the Act provides for it, and certainly we should push boards to the extent we know them, or if we know people in them who are sensitive, to support agriculturally diverse, sustainable systems.
Thank you. I think we'll stop here. This has been remarkably informative and a rich load of knowledge. We could go on and on. And certainly, what Sujata and I enjoyed most about this, I think, is the kind of the confidence and the optimism that you displayed throughout. And I think continually thank you for that. So thanks again, Ashish, and thanks to everyone who's been here. We're going to record this. We've recorded this, so we're going to put this up on YouTube. So those who've missed it will certainly have a chance. Do you want
to give them the name of the YouTube?
The channel? Yeah, the YouTube channel is called Sustainable Farming Colloquium. So if you search for that, there's one already, Anjali Jha from a month ago, and yours will be the second one in the series.
Thank you, Sujata. Thanks, Chela. Thanks for the opportunity.